Some weeks ago I made a video about the nature of magic in Tolkien's universe, but it's such a vast and complex topic that I could not cover everything. One example would be the dark powers or dark magic. Even though Tolkien didn't really use the English term dark magic, I could only find it in the Unfinished Tales once, and beyond that only the Sindarin translation Guldur and Morgul, which also mean dark sorcery or dark secret knowledge. A related term we, however, find several times in his works is necromancy, and this will be our topic for today. Undead 4500, fitting name by the way, also asked about necromancy some months ago in the comments. Before we start, a few hints. Obviously, spoiler warning. I'll try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, and shoutouts to Kimberly80 who allowed me to use her art in my videos. So, what's necromancy? Its etymology seems to be based on ancient Greek, consisting of nekros, meaning dead, and manteia, meaning divination. So it's fortune-telling by using the dead. Of course, divination in of itself is a more complex area than just pure fortune-telling, but that's another topic. If I hear necromancy, I usually think of fantasy works. The necromancer class was introduced in Dungeons & Dragons edition 3.5, which I played a lot in the early 2000s. I also remember Diablo 2's necromancer class, or Guild Wars 1 had it too. But these are all from around 2000 and probably have heavily influenced our modern perception of necromancy towards some kind of a gothic magician who can summon skeletons and alike to fight for him. But of course, even in Tolkien's The Hobbit from 1937, we find the necromancer. H.P. Lovecraft wrote about it in the late 20s too, but necromancy is even older than that. For example, we can find it in the Bible, and here again in a more classical sense considering the meaning of the word. In the first book of Samuel, chapter 28, we can read about the witch of Endor, who summons the dead prophet Samuel for King Saul to ask him some questions. And yes, to my knowledge, Endor from Star Wars references the village from the Bible. This was written down probably 2600 years ago, and in, for example, the German Luther translation, in some others too, they even use the German word for necromancer, Totenbeschwörer. Of course, there are many other stories and myths from the past where we find this term, and the essence is always pretty similar. Necromancy is about communicating with the dead and is also classically related with divination. Maybe it's just my perception, but the divination part seems to have moved a bit into the background in our modern times and their stories. For example, I sometimes get the question if Sauron as necromancer can raise skeletons. So now that we have a good overview about what necromancy means, we can look into what Tolkien did with it. As mentioned, the first time he uses this term is in The Hobbit. Gandalf explains to the others how he found Thorin's father Thróin. Quote, "How he got there, I don't know, but I found him a prisoner in the dungeons of the necromancer." As often explained, The Hobbit was originally not part of Tolkien's mythology, so not part of the universe where The Lord of the Rings takes place. Tolkien later changed some little details in the second edition of The Hobbit to make it fit to The Lord of the Rings he was working on and his mythology. So one could argue that the necromancer and Sauron were originally not the same entity, but it seems Tolkien had the idea for Sauron quite early because in letter 19 from December 1937, some months after the release of The Hobbit, he wrote, "I think it is plain that quite apart from it, a sequel or successor to The Hobbit is called for. I promise to give this thought and attention, but I'm sure you will sympathize when I say that the construction of elaborate and consistent mythology and two languages rather occupies the mind, and the Silmarils are in my heart. So that goodness knows what will happen. Mr. Baggins began as a comic tale among conventional and inconsistent Grimm's fairy tale dwarfs, and got drawn into the edge of it, so that even Sauron the Terrible peeped over the edge." Keep in mind, the first and second book of The Lord of the Rings were released in 1954. All three books were already written at this time, so this idea survived for quite some time in Tolkien's mind. The biggest question is now, what does Sauron do to be known as the Necromancer? In The Hobbit he's used as a dark power beyond the scope of the story itself, giving the world a mysterious frame and expanding it, at least in the mind of the readers. The plot of the dwarves does not really cross the paths of the necromancer, and they even avoid getting close to Dol Guldur. It's stated by Gandalf that his power is beyond what the dwarves could handle, even all the dwarves of Middle-earth together, even though Thorin expresses that the necromancer should not be neglected. The Hobbit films focus a bit on this side story, which is only barely mentioned in The Hobbit. Tolkien later explains it more in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings, so a lot of what The Hobbit films show of it can actually be found in The Lord of the Rings. The most obvious component of necromancy is Sauron commanding wraiths. This is also referenced during the First Age. In the Silmarillion we can read, Sauron was become now a sorcerer of dreadful power, master of shadows and phantoms, foul in wisdom, cruel in strength, misshaping what he touched, twisting what he ruled, lord of werewolves. His dominion was torment. He's a master of shadows and phantoms, and after he gifted the 9 rings of power to lords of men, he got 9 very powerful servants with the Nazgul, and we should also include the effect of the Morgul knife that can turn at least men into wraiths too. Interesting side note, some say there were kings under the 9, but I could not find the reference for it in the books. It's only explained that some of them were lords. The Silmarillion states that 3 were great Numenorean lords, and only the Witch King is described as great sorcerer and king of old. However, back to the topic. A weird detail here, the ring wraiths never really died. They were just transformed into the state, and of course you could call them undead. The Hobbit films portray this very differently though, but Sauron did not summon them from the realm of the dead, which is in Tolkien's world the halls of Mandos or the Unseen. He just gifted 9 rings to men, dominated them through his power and the One Ring, and over time they faded into being wraiths and slaves of Sauron's will. That can be seen as some kind of necromancy, especially inside the world, considering that this knowledge is not widely spread in Middle-earth. There could be all kinds of origin theories for the Nazgul, even for example among the scholars. It must also be considered that the Nazgul first appeared 2nd Age 2251, and the phrase Master of Shadows and Phantoms is from the First Age, mentioned around the Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. And indeed, we find fitting earlier examples. We can read in the Silmarillion about phantoms in the forest Taur nu Fuin in Beleriand, where phantoms pursued lost wanderers to madness through the forest or even strangled them. They were probably sent there by the first Dark Lord Morgoth or by his servant Sauron, but that's not really a huge difference. We come to this point in a moment. The evil Valar Morgos also had Maiar, angels of lower rank, while Valar are angels of highest rank, in his service, and they could take shapes or appear as phantoms too. They probably hunted the early elves wandering alone, and some of the elves even disappeared forever. Again, not necromancy, because those angels are spirit beings called Ainur by nature and can take a physical form if they want. They are no dead beings. We can also read in the Silmarillion that after the First War, Morgoth originally gathered spirits, probably these mentioned Maiar and comparable spirit beings, around him when he hid beyond the walls of night, so outside the boundaries of Arda. There's also the unusual story of Gorlim, one of Barahir's companions. Barahir is the father of Beren, both ancestors of Aragorn, who also wears the ring of Barahir. Here Sauron used an illusion to lure Gorlim to his house, who thought his wife was there. It's described that he even saw her face and heard her voice, but it was a trap of Sauron, and he was made to betray Barahir. Still, I would not consider this necromancy and more an illusion, but it fits a master of shadows and phantoms. There are other occasional mentions of shadows, shapes and phantoms in Tolkien's other works, and even in The Lord of the Rings, for example in the Dead Marshes. I would not include the Oathbreakers because they are cursed and not summoned. I mentioned a moment ago that it's not a huge difference if Sauron or Morgoth send the phantoms. The reason for this is that the dark powers and necromancy have their origin within Morgoth and him tainting the world. As explained in my Why Elves Have to Leave Middle-earth video, Morgoth was insanely powerful and used much of his power to taint the very fabric of Arda, the world itself, with it. After this, the world has a state called Arda Mard. Tolkien's son Christopher Tolkien references this in the term Morgoth's ring. You could say the whole world is his one ring in which his evil power survives as long as the world itself exists, comparable to the One Ring and Sauron, just much bigger. This is important to understand. It depends on how canon you see the following writings, but in the History of Middle-earth book, which is also called Morgoth's Ring, Christopher Tolkien published some texts his father worked on in the late 50s that cover the topics of death, evil magic, spirits and necromancy. We can read: "For the unbodied wandering in the world are those who at least have refused the door of life and remain in regret and self-pity. Some are filled with bitterness, grievance and envy. Some were enslaved by the Dark Lord and do his work still, though he himself is gone. They will not speak truth or wisdom. To call on them is folly. To attempt to master them and to make them servants of one's own will is wickedness. Such practices are of Morgoth, and the necromancers are of the host of Sauron, his servant." And later in Morgoth's Ring we can read: "It was this Morgoth element in matter, indeed, which was a prerequisite for such magic and other evils as Sauron practiced with it and upon it." So ultimately, Morgoth and his evil power is the origin and maybe even the source of necromancy and dark magic. We also learn that Sauron and necromancy are connected because he seems to be an expert on this, or maybe even the founder of this, let's call it, Tree of the Dark Powers. It must also be noted that the first quote is from a time when Tolkien still considered rebirth for elves after they were killed. He later changed his mind completely on this and changed it into re-embodiment on the western continent Aman, the Undying Lands. If we now come to my last two examples of Sauron's necromancy, we probably come a bit back to the classic meaning of the word. The first example would be the Barrow-wights. As explained in my Tom Bombadil and also in the 7th episode of my Books and Film Differences series, we know that the Witch King of Angmar summoned the Barrow-wights to the Barrow Downs of Cardolan, one of the three kingdoms Arnor split into. Arnor is Gondor's brother kingdom in the north. Quote, "It was at this time that an end came of the Dún Edain of Cardolan, and evil spirits out of Angmar and Hrúdauer entered into the deserted mounds and dwelt there." Hrúdauer and Arthedain were the names of the other two kingdoms Arnor split into. In Hrúdauer, the line of the Dún Edain kings failed, and they allied with Angmar, which was the realm of the Witch King. Even though Tolkien differentiates these places here, it's all the Witch King's realm. Where those spirits are from originally is hard to say, even what they are exactly. If they were spirits from ancient times or transformed beings, we don't know. Theories range from fallen Maiar over to elvish wraiths, but it seems Sauron has taught the Witch King to communicate with evil spirits and summon them to haunt a specific place. They even stirred the bones and golden rings and chains in the mounds, so this comes actually really close to what we imagine under necromancy and fantasy today. What always makes me wonder a bit is that the Barrow-wights could use magic. This is absent from most of the other examples. Phantoms or ghosts are usually just scary and have some limited options of interaction with the physical world, but they don't use powerful magic. Would they be spirits of dead men? This would potentially mean that they got more powerful while being dead, which seems very unlikely to me. Men usually don't use magical songs like Maiar or very powerful elves because they don't have the authority and knowledge of the world and the unseen. When we read the essay from Morgoth's Ring I mentioned earlier, it could be concluded that they are elf race, a famous theory, but as mentioned, Tolkien later changed his mind on some parts of it, and there are no examples of elf race elsewhere. They are a pretty special case, like the Barrow Wights themselves, which would fit, I guess. I always asked myself why Sauron or the Witch King didn't use more evil spirits to haunt important places of Middle-earth. Barrow Wights are potentially weak to sunlight, so there are some limitations, but they could haunt the ruins of Osgiliath, the woods around Bree, the halls of Erebor, Moria, or even areas of Rohan, but they only appear in the Barrow Downs close to Tom Bombadil, which makes me think that they are an enigma like Tom 2, and only there to fit the mysterious character of these chapters. I will also make an extra video about the Barrow Wights at some point. However, they were spirits with some undead characteristics that were summoned to haunt a specific place. Maybe they were once elves, which would actually make them undead and fitting to necromancy. What they don't do is divination, but there is a form of contact and probably communication with them. In the Unfinished Tales, we can read in notes on the movements of the Black Riders at that time, it is said that the Black Captain stayed there for some days and the Barrow Wights were roused, and all things of evil spirit, hostile to elves and men, were on the watch with malice in the Old Forest and on the Barrow Downs. So the Witch King, who once summoned them there from his old realm, roused the Barrow Wights before Frodo and his friends went there, and also stayed there for some days. Maybe the divination part was knowing that the hobbits will go there, and Tom Bombadil intervened by teaching the hobbits his song. While still mysterious, I think it's a prime example for Sauron and his servants as necromancers. I talked about two examples. The last one are the two watchers at the entrance of the Tower of Cirith Ungol in Mordor. Two strange statues that were possessed by an evil spirit. They were able to stop anybody unwanted to enter and leave the tower, who could not surpass its power of will. Sam used Galadriel's file to pass them and escaped from the tower with Frodo again, and after this they made a weird noise like an alarm. Even the arch of the gate crashed behind the hobbits, almost killing them. To me, it seems like Sauron used his necromancy to possess those statues, creating an additional obstacle beyond Shelob for trespassers from outside entering and from inside fleeing from Mordor. Again, it seems like they have magical power or authority, at least over the gate, but they also had the ability to communicate by alarming Sauron's servants. For example, the orcs knew that the two Silent Watchers were uneasy 2 days ago, probably sensing the One Ring or trouble coming their way. Summoning spirits to secure a passage also sounds plausible within my imagination of necromancy. For me, it seems that in Tolkien's world, the necromancy of the Maya Sauron is often about communicating and placing evil spirits to haunt specific places, even in the First Age if we think about the phantoms in the forest. Maiar, as spirit beings, can see the unseen and are part of it, but they also have authority and power. In addition, all dark powers are connected to the first Dark Lord Morgoth, and with this, necromancy is too. And while the Barrow Wights come close to the summoned walking skeletons we know from, for example, video games, they seem more like a mysterious exception inside the world. But even they, as exceptions, sing about the Dark Lord in their strange songs, and so they must be connected to Sauron and Morgoth too. Spirits usually seem to have very limited options when it comes to interaction with the physical world. Often it's just communication, haunting people to madness, or appear in their dreams. For example, Merry has a dream while he was under the spell of the Barrow Wights of the Men of Carn Dûm, which is the Witch King's stronghold in his realm Angmar. In the dream, these men thrust a spear through his heart. Of course, these unusual spirit beings could actually interact with the physical world, while others, for example the mentioned Gorlim from the First Age, who became a wraith after Sauron killed him, could probably not, and was only able to warn Barahir's son Beren of his betrayal in a dream. This brings us back again to the concept of summoning a spirit and asking it to do something, even though it's not about foretelling the future or retelling forgotten secrets from the distant past. Else Sauron or the Witch King would have probably just summoned Isildur or one of the orcs who was at the Gladden Fields and asked them about what happened to the One Ring. Sauron found out very late what actually happened with the ring. It seems that he even thought for a while that it was actually destroyed. With all this said, necromancy stays mysterious and mythologic. Ghosts in forests, old graves, or even evil spirits haunting the misty mountains. However, we still find the ancient aspect of communication with the dead within Tolkien's world, but his idea of necromancy also moved towards our today's conception of it in modern fantasy works, and it seems Tolkien is actually one of the connections between the ancient and the modern view. Thank you for watching. This was a very complex topic and again a long video. It still feels like I'm just scratching the surface and this won't be the last video related to this topic. I hope you found this video interesting and worth your time. If so, check my other lore videos if you're interested. And if you want to support my channel further, leave a like, post a comment, recommend my videos to other fans of the films and books, or even subscribe and maybe press the annoying bell if you want to get notified on YouTube. I can also recommend my detailed books and films differences series. Playlist is in the description. Next video will again be lore related. There are still some interesting topics I want to cover. In secret, I also prepare a bigger lore topic in the background, but no clue when it will be ready. I tried to do this in parallel so I can continue to release videos and avoid abandoning my channel for 8 weeks. We will see how this works out. I also think about another gaming related video. In case you have lore questions for videos, feel free to write them in the comments too. Again, thank you for watching and goodbye.